So, Steven Universe Future has ended, and it ended in the most on-brand way that the show possibly could have, with all of the people throughout Steven's life giving him a hug and healing him from his corruption. But what exactly did this entire scene mean, and does it mean that this hug completely rid Steven of all of his problems? Turns out, it's a bit more complicated than that. Steven Universe Future is very much a show about Steven's relationship with himself and the mental illness that came as a result of how unhealthy it is. Steven is a very confused teenager who lacks an identity and who is traumatized due to the past events in his life. This includes, but is not limited to, watching his loved ones almost die and almost dying himself on several occasions. This has led to angry outbursts and panic, which eventually lead into a complete mental breakdown and his corruption. And as much as I'd love to brag about how I was right about this theory becoming canon after months of being bashed for believing it, explaining its significance is more important. This hug scene didn't suddenly and magically solve all of Steven's problems, so what exactly did it do other than surface level uncorruption? Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about that. After accidentally shattering Jasper and having intrusive thoughts and urges about shattering White Diamond, Steven begins to have a mental breakdown. He begins to believe that he's a fraud and a monster because the actions that he just committed or thought about committing were against his morals. For the entirety of Steven Universe, Steven himself always preached about how shattering a gem is wrong and how a peaceful resolution should always be attempted before a violent one. So when he begins to both enact and think violent thoughts, he feels as though his morals have been compromised and that he tricked people into actually believing that he thinks this way. He thinks that he's a fraud and he's not a good person because of intrusive thoughts and accidental destruction. He sees himself being just as bad as the Diamonds and those who hurt him, since he stooped to the very same level that he would have once criticized them for when he was younger. He feels as though having these violent, intrusive thoughts is just as bad as committing them, and since he feels this way, he's no different than a Diamond. How could he preach a message of love, forgiveness, and acceptance if he himself was no longer fully committed to that pacifist ideology? In his mind, if he thought about doing these violent actions, it must mean that he no longer believes that way. And this isn't at all true, considering violent, intrusive thoughts are normal, especially if you've been traumatized. That said, you don't need to be traumatized or have PTSD to have them. Several other mental disorders, such as OCD, can also cause severe intrusive thinking. Violent, intrusive thoughts like this are unfortunately normal, but if you don't know that, you can scare yourself into thinking you're a bad and dangerous person. It doesn't mean that you'll go through with these actions or commit them, it just means that the thought involuntarily crosses your mind, whether you believe in or plan on committing the action or not. But I digress. Steven doesn't like or idolize the Diamonds. It's far from it, in fact. It's made very clear that the Diamonds are family members that he's social with for the benefit of others, but beyond his blood relationship with them, he attempts to keep his distance. Like Spinell says in Homeworld Bound, he doesn't even call or visit them and actively avoids them. The Diamonds have put Steven and his friends and family through so much trauma and hardship that it isn't really difficult to understand why he doesn't want to be like them. White Diamond was the source of all of his problems and had even attempted to kill him at one point in order to retrieve and separate him from Pink Diamond. After seeing and interacting with other people who they had hurt, it would make sense that he would view any similarities between him and his Diamond family members as a bad thing. So when he shattered Jasper with his Diamond abilities and later thought about shattering White Diamond as revenge, this got him to view himself as a monster. Shattering a gem, corrupting them, or using them in experiments are all things that the Diamonds have done. So while just an accident, it is still similar enough to what the Diamonds had done to draw similarities to his own actions. Steven's viewing of himself as a monster is largely due to the fact that he views the Diamonds and their actions as such. It's been stated by Rebecca, as well as shown in Future, that Steven has not yet forgiven the Diamonds for the pain that they've put him through. So Steven realizing that he's a Diamond and thinking that his thought process may not be so different from theirs after all, leads him into having a mental breakdown. Steven's corruption is different from corruption in a traditional sense in that his physical form is reflecting how he views himself. He sees himself as a monster, and so his powers are reflecting that in his monstrous physical form. However, it is similar to corruption in that it's a result of trauma. All of the events in Steven's life had led to him being traumatized, which is what led to this horrible self-image that he has of himself. So while he wasn't corrupted in a way that was similar to how the gems affected by the damage of the diamonds were, both of these instances happened because of trauma. I explained this deeper in a previous video that I've done, which I'll link in the info card, but Steven's corruption happened because of his trauma. Steven can't help but feel like a fraud and a monster because he's hurt someone, and that's why he corrupts. Does this mean that he's actually a monster? No, of course not, and that's why the hug was needed to make him realize that and return him to normal. While it may seem like a highly cliche and anticlimactic way of dealing with things, it was the only way to fix the problem. Steven was going to stay a monster as long as he believed he was one, and so fighting him would only worsen the issue. This is because it would only enforce the belief within him that he is a monster if they felt the need to fight him. Hugging Steven to show him that they still loved him, despite now seeing the not so nice side of him, was the only way to help him, to show him that they weren't afraid of him despite how daunting his flaws and issues were. His trauma and his feelings associated with it doesn't make him a monster, they make him human. And so his family and friends showing him that they still love him despite all of this is what led to his uncorruption, because he could see that no one viewed him as a monster except for himself, and that they still loved him even after seeing the worst side of him. This didn't fix the problem, of course, it was only mitigating and stopping a mental health crisis. Steven's corruption was the end result of avoiding and failing to deal with his trauma in a healthy way. But what a lot of people seem to be thinking is that Steven is fine and that his problems were solved after this hug just because he was uncorrupted. And the truth is, Steven still has a lot of problems. Just because he was uncorrupted doesn't mean that all of his problems left with the horns, and that much is evident. Steven's corruption was a crisis situation. A mental health crisis situation is when someone reaches the point where their actions, feelings, and behaviors can lead to them hurting themselves or others, and/or put them at risk of being unable to care for themselves or function in the community in a healthy manner. Steven reached his crisis point in the episode Everything's Fine, and it continued to bubble over and became worse in I Am My Monster. Just because Steven is no longer in crisis doesn't mean that he is no longer struggling with his mental illnesses. It just means that he's no longer in a situation where he's considered to be a threat to himself or to others. The hug was meant to pull Steven out of a crisis and bring him back to a state where he was no longer dangerous. This embrace, though endearing, did not and was not meant to completely solve or heal Steven's mental state. That would take months and even years worth of self-reflection and work, and is why the series ended in the way that it did. Steven had a support network to help him and pull him from his lowest point, but it's ultimately up to him to heal and move on with his life past his trauma. As mentioned in the episode The Future, he's taking those steps by both distancing himself from Beach City as well as actively going to therapy. These two things were what he felt were appropriate steps to moving forward in his life and healing from his trauma. This is an entire process that doesn't end at the climax, and it's even a journey that's going to take place off screen. While I wish we could be involved and see Steven's path to recovery, I do respect the decision to keep that part of his life private. Rebecca has stated that there's more to these characters and that she knows what happens after this point in the story, but she wants to give the characters privacy and time to heal, not needing to perform for anyone. And while I do understand that these are fictional characters that we're talking about here, it is a bold statement to make that I respect. People who have been hurt and traumatized need time and privacy to heal, and so that's been reflected in the story ending where it did. So did the hug and the Steven Universe Future climax solve the problem? No. Steven still has a long road to recovery, and it didn't end at him being brought down from a mental health crisis. In fact, it was only the beginning. Future was a series that marked the start of Steven's new life and the start of his recovery arc. He may have been under the impression that he had already undergone that, but he really had only been avoiding it. Going out to see the world and find himself and becoming his own person that isn't just Gem Human Ambassador is the first step and not the last. And that's why I feel like the finale ended up being super underwhelming to a lot of people, because it was what Steven needed. What he needed wasn't some grand gesture or permanent solution. What he needed was being told that everything was alright and that his support system wasn't going anywhere and that they were there for him. And that's what he ended up getting through the hug. Corrupted Steven was Steven's spiraling mental health crisis, and the hug was his family and friends pulling him out of it. What Steven experiences off screen is the start of his real life and the beginning of his future. So yeah, while it is a bittersweet ending, I can't help but feel hopeful from the message that Steven Universe Future brought. That you can come back from your lowest point and that you can move on to have a future. And I think that that is a message that a lot of us needed to hear. And if in the future you'd like to see more analysis videos like this from me, why not subscribe and hit that bell icon to get notifications of when I upload. Special thank you to my top tier patrons, Ambrose Rothwood, Brandon Nunes, The Lovely Ghosty, Lee Taylor, and Zachary Ansley. Because of people like them, I can continue to make content like this. And I hope to see you all in the next video. Have an amazing day, guys.